Good to see you all here this morning, and if you're visiting with us, we want you to know that you're our honored guests. We ask that you stick around for a moment, give us an opportunity to get to know you. Also, some of our members have prepared like a little gift for you as you're leaving, so make sure you get that as well. Do want to make mention of a couple of visitors that are with us this morning. So Sam and Paula Briscoe are with us from the High Desert Church of Christ, where I preached in Apple Valley, California. So we're glad that you're with us. Also, Brett and Julie Petrillo, and I was going to say they're kids, but there's like 4 and 1 on the way. So Tribe is with us. And if you're not familiar with Brett, well, this past Wednesday during the summer series on Wednesday night, we had Sage Bridges come out and give us our lesson. Sage is the incoming youth and family minister at the Bear Valley Church of Christ in Denver, Colorado. Brett is the outgoing youth and family minister at the Bear Valley Church of Christ in Denver, Colorado. So I guess we're having like a Bear Valley reunion, so to speak. But we're glad he's with us. Brett's going to be taking on a role with the Bear Valley Bible Institute, the school there. And so please pray for his efforts, and we're grateful for the work that he does and for their safe journey home. So appreciate them being here with us. We come to Matthew chapter 22, and here in verses 15 through 22, what we find is, again, this is the Passion Week. If you've been following along as we've gone through the book of Matthew, you know that this is the final week of Jesus on earth before he will go to the cross. And ultimately, what we find here is the Pharisees are not happy with what has taken place. If you go back just a few verses, you recall there were several parables that Jesus had proclaimed, and ultimately those parables were condemning of the Pharisees specifically. And we note that they understood that as you look at the passages there in Matthew chapter 21 and chapter 22. They know that Jesus is speaking about them. And it's interesting that it says here in chapter 22, and I hope you have your Bibles open to Matthew chapter 22 as I give you a brief recap at the beginning of this sermon before we get to the points that I want to make. But as we get to this portion, Jesus, ultimately it says there that the Pharisees and the Herodians, or the disciples of the Pharisees and the Herodians, went to Jesus with a question. Now, just that fact alone is shocking. If you're not familiar with the breakdown of the groups of people that existed in the first century, the Pharisees are kind of the religious groups, and they're not happy that they're under Roman rule. They believe that Israel ought to be under their own rule, that ultimately the rule ought to come from the Jews themselves, and you have the Roman Empire that's overseeing this entire area. The Herodians, on the other hand, are those that support Herod. The Herods are put in place by the Roman Empire to govern those particular regions. So the Herodians are actually in favor of the Romans being overseeing this area. So here you have two groups that are diametrically opposed. In fact, we would say they're enemies, so to speak, but they come together for a common purpose to challenge a threat that they see greater than even one another, that threat being Jesus. You've heard the saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Essentially, that's what you have here. You have these two groups, the Pharisees and the Herodians, that are coming to Jesus with a question. And I'm convinced, although the text doesn't specifically say this, I'm convinced that they're both there because they believe regardless of which way Jesus answers, one of those groups can attack him. You see, if Jesus says to them that they shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar, then you have the Herodians that support the Roman Empire who are going to say that ultimately here's somebody that's under dissent to the Romans, and so they can bring an accusation against him in that way. But if they say you should pay taxes to Caesar, well, the people are not appropriate, that don't want to be under Roman rule either, the Jewish people that are there, and so he's going to lose credibility with the people, and the Pharisees can say, look, he's just a puppet head of Rome. They believe they have Jesus in a conundrum. They think regardless of the way he answers the question, one of these two groups can make an accusation against him. They obviously don't understand Jesus very well. And they try to set this trap for him. Look at verses 15 and 16 and notice what they say. Although the statement they make in verse 16 is correct, they're actually dishonest in the way that they say it. Look at verse 15. It says, the Pharisees went and took counsel together about how they might trap him in what he said. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth, and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any. Look how many times they say truth, and yet they're lying. Think about this also, that the Pharisees consider themselves to be God's chosen people, and yet they believe it's okay to lie in order to accomplish what they want to accomplish. They have that kind of standards. But those aren't the things that I really want us to focus on. I want us to kind of focus on the question a little bit and Jesus' response to the question. The question is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Is it lawful to pay taxes? And Jesus' response really disarms them. He asked for them to bring a coin, and then they ask what image and inscription is on the coin of this denarius, which, by the way, it's a Roman coin that's about 1 day's wages. That's about how much it is. And so they say it's Caesar, and then he responds to them with some points. And I want us to focus on verse 21, as the remainder of our lesson will come from verse 21, but I have several passages from other books that I'm going to put on the slides, so you'll be able to follow along with the slides if you want to make notes of the other references that we're going to mention this morning. First of all, he says, render unto Caesar, or render to Caesar. Now in the question is about tax. And they ask the question again, trying to trap him, whether it's lawful to pay taxes to Caesar. And Jesus' response, as I mentioned a moment ago, is it really disarms them. But I want us to focus not so much on what this question means to them, the Jews. I want us to focus on Jesus' response and what it means to us. What does it mean to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's? Certainly we understand in the context it's talking about tax or money that's there. But I want us to look at it in a more broader sense. Caesar is a representation of the government at that time. He is the leader of that area. And I want us to understand, as we think about this from our perspective, what would we do to render unto the government, to ask ourselves some questions. And when we do, I want us to recognize, when we think about how we as Christians ought to render to the government, there's some passages that I think are very valuable to help us to understand what our obligation is. Maybe this is an appropriate time, with November looming and with all the political things going on, to talk about how we as Christians ought to respond to our government. How should we respond? Well, I don't know of any better passage than Romans 13 to talk about the importance of government, although I will give you a passage from 1 Peter as well. But Romans chapter 13 really lays out for us what our responsibility is. We should ask some questions. Anytime we look at Scripture, we say who's writing, and in this particular case, it's the Apostle Paul. We say, who is he writing to? He's writing to the churches that are located in the city of Rome, that are under Roman rule. Here's what he says in chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, and speaking to the Christians that are living under this Roman rule in Rome. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist have been appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists that authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and those who oppose, and I'm sorry that cut off, will receive condemnation upon themselves. Think about that for a moment. Paul writing to Christians in Rome. You think they all had it well in Rome in the first century under Roman rule? And yet his requirement, his response to them is that they are to be in subjection. That word means to place yourself in submission to someone. We've said this before, and I'll repeat it for the purposes of reminder, and for those who haven't been here before, perhaps for you to better understand. Submission is demonstrated when we do what we don't want to do. You see, if somebody tells us to do something and we were going to do it anyway, we really didn't submit. We were going to do it anyway. It's when somebody tells us something that we don't want to do, and we do it, that we demonstrate submission. You recall just the previous chapter in Matthew chapter 21, that there was Jesus gave the parable about the father who had two sons, and he went to the first son and he said, "Go into the field and work," and the response of that son says, "I will not." But then it says he regretted it and he went out in the field and worked. And he went to the second son and he said the same thing, "Go out in the field and work." And the second son responded, "I will, sir." But then he didn't go out in the field and work. You see, the first son, the one that said, "I will not work," but then regretted it and went out in the field and worked, demonstrated submission. He didn't want to go out in the field and work, but ultimately he did. The second son, who said, "I will, sir, go out in the field and work," and did not demonstrate submission. So we think about submitting to the governing authorities, or placing ourselves in submission to them, or subjecting ourselves to them. We should recognize that it's God who places those governing authorities in place. So regardless of who our president is going to be, who your congressman, man or woman is going to be, who your governor is going to be, etc., we should understand that God placed those people in authority. And you might think, depending on which political side of the arena you're on, you might look at the other candidate from the other side, and you might say something like, "Well, Mark, you don't understand how they're going to destroy our nation and how they're going to do this to Christianity," or whatever it might be. Well, recognize that God throughout history has placed leaders in their role. For instance, I think about King Nebuchadnezzar. And in Jeremiah 27, if you're not familiar with King Nebuchadnezzar, he was a king of the Babylonian Empire during the time that the Babylonians took the two southern tribes of Judah into captivity for 70 years. You recall, if you read the book of Daniel, you'll find that that entire book was written at a time that they were in Babylonian captivity. They were slaves under Nebuchadnezzar. Here's what God had to say about Nebuchadnezzar in Jeremiah 27, verse 6. He says, "I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant. And I have given him even the wild beasts of the field to serve him." Recognize that God, by the way, if you read that whole account of what took place, you'll find that the prophets, God told the prophets, go to the southern, this is before they went into captivity, go to the southern tribes of Judah, and you're going to tell them, go into captivity. You're going to be in captivity for 70 years. And the false prophets were going around saying, "No, we're not going into captivity." Others were saying, "No, it won't be 70 years. It won't be 7 years. And God even told them, "Don't try to flee to Egypt. If you go to Egypt, I'm going to destroy you. I want you, my people, to be in Babylonian captivity." And God used Nebuchadnezzar to accomplish that. And there in Jeremiah 27, he calls Nebuchadnezzar my servant. God placed Nebuchadnezzar in that role for a purpose. And as my friend Sage Bridges would say, those of you who are here on Wednesday night know when I gave his introduction what I'm talking about, it wasn't all butterflies and rainbows for the Jews in Babylonian captivity. They suffered greatly. And you might ask the question, well, why would God use a king that would cause that suffering? The answer to that question is God have a plan. And so let me just share with you this morning, regardless of your political views and which candidate you might hope gets into office or not, understand this: whoever gets voted in, God placed them there. And God is in charge. And God will determine what steps will occur in this country ultimately. We as Christians are to put ourselves in submission to those governing authorities, regardless of which one is in power. Peter addresses similarly as Paul did in Romans in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 and 15. He uses the same Greek word there, be subject, same word that means to place yourself in submission to. Be subject for the sake of the Lord to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to the governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do good. For such is the will of God, that by doing good you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. God's will in our lives is that we be subject to the governing authorities by which He put them in place. I want to go back to Romans for a moment, and you'll notice verse 2 there. Whoever resists the authority, the one God put in place, has opposed the ordinance of God. Those are very strong words when you think about what we might think of a political candidate and what our role is as Christians. God's will in our lives is for us to be subject to the governing authority He has put in place. So when we ask the question, what should we render unto our government? Submission. We should place ourselves in subjection to them because God put them in place. The second response Jesus had in this was to say, render to God the things due God. We might ask the question, what is our obligation to God? What should I render to God? I showed you a moment ago Romans chapter 13, where there Paul, in writing to the Christians in Rome, discussed how they should relate to the governing authorities. Just one chapter earlier, in Romans chapter 12, Paul would tell those same Christians in Rome how they ought to react to God, what they ought to render to God. And in chapter 12, verse number 1, he says, I exhort you, brothers, by the mercies of God, present your bodies as a sacrifice, living, holy, and pleasing to God, which is your spiritual service. You see, we're called as Christians to render an offering to God. What is that offering? It's ultimately to be our lives, to be a living sacrifice. The word present there actually means to put at someone's disposal, which essentially means if you're a Christian here this morning, if you're a member of this congregation, that your role here, according to Paul talking to the Christians in Rome, is to place your life at the disposal of the Lord to do the work that He's set out for the church to do. There's to be an offering. When you think about an offering, is there any better example of an offering than Jesus Himself going to the cross, offering Himself on the cross for you and me? Our response, Paul is saying in Romans 12, is to present our bodies as a sacrifice to God. And he says a living sacrifice. And by the way, a living sacrifice is one, according to this verse, that's holy and pleasing to God. You know what? Some people say that I submit myself to God, or I put myself in service to God, but I choose how I'm going to do that. You recognize that this verse says that the living sacrifice God wants is one that's holy and pleasing to Him. It's based on what He wants and not necessarily on what you want. It says there at the end of that verse that this is our spiritual service of worship. I like the way the New King James says it. It says, which is your reasonable service. It's reasonable to understand if you're a Christian, you ought to be offering yourself as a sacrifice that's holy and pleasing to God. We're not talking about physical sacrifice. We're talking about a living sacrifice that offers yourself in the service of the Lord. It's the spiritual service of God. And just a few verses later, a few verses after this verse in chapter 12, verse 1, Paul would explain another way that they can do that. And in verses 10 through 18, I've highlighted a few things that I want us to focus on. But notice what he says there, that in this spiritual service we're to be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Again, speaking to Christians, he's saying, brethren, you should be devoted to your fellow Christians in brotherly love. And not only that, but you give preference to one another in honor. Imagine a congregation or church where I'm looking out for your best interests and you're looking out for my best interests. I'm not focused on what I want, I'm focused on what you want. You're not focused on what you want, you're focused on what I want. Would we have some of the splits that occur in the churches of Christ because of personality, conflicts, and problems if you're looking out for my best interests and I'm looking out for your best interests? Here Paul's saying if we're going to be that living sacrifice that's holy and pleasing to God, we ought to be those that are devoted to one another, giving preference to one another as well. Look at verse 13. Contributing to the needs of the saints, pursuing hospitality. That means that when I have a brother or sister in need, I'm there to help them, to assist them. Go down to verse 16. Being of the same mind toward one another, not being haughty in mind, but associating with the humble. And finally there in verse 18, so far as it depends on you, being at peace with all men. Sometimes we focus on what others do to us. Paul here is telling you as a Christian, you focus on what you can do. And whatever you can do all you can do to be at peace with all men. Did you notice what was not mentioned in all of this? He talked about rendering to the government, talked about rendering to God, and in his explanation here, Paul would say that one of the ways we offer that spiritual sacrifice is in how we serve our brethren and how to take care of the brethren. You notice what's not mentioned there? You. Yourself is not mentioned. You know, our world has this, I'm going to call it our priority chain of command. The world has a priority chain of command that goes something like this. You first, others second, God last. They have it completely backwards. Scripture would say, God first, others second, self last. Again, imagine for yourself, imagine a congregation that operates in that way, where God is placed first in all the decisions that are made. Secondly to that is only the other brethren. We look out for, once we made sure that we're doing things in accordance with God's will, then when it comes to matters of opinion, I'm relying on your opinion even before my own. Again, we wouldn't have some of the splits and the differences of opinion and the conflicts that occur in the church if we would just adapt in our minds these kinds of mentalities. And just understand, it's simple to remember, but hard to put into practice. God first, others second, self last. Our role is to render to God a life that's of spiritual service to Him, and in doing so, we place others even above ourselves. We render to God our life in service. We also render to God in how our acts are towards the governing authorities and towards others. We read in Romans chapter 13 that if we resist the governing authorities, we actually are resisting the ordinances of God. And I want to remind you that that letter was written to a group of Christians that were under Roman rule, who were being persecuted by the very government in which Paul says, submit to them. What should we do? We should be in submission to them. In this challenge by the disciples of the Pharisees and the Herodians, we find a principle on how we're to live. We're to render to the government what is due and to render to God what is due Him. Our personal preferences and personal likes should take a back seat to our service to Him. Each of you this morning has to look at your own life and ask the question, what is my priority chain of command? What do I place first? Is it self? Is it others? Is it God? You have to look at it and determine whether you need to make some rearranging, if you've got to change some things in your life. And you might ask the question, well, how do I do that? I think Paul gives us a great explanation in the very verse that follows chapter 12, verse number 1, in Romans chapter 12, verse number 2. He says, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed. How, Paul? How am I transformed? By the renewing of your mind, that you may approve what the will of God is, that which is good and pleasing and perfect. What is Paul saying here? He's saying that in order to change my action, I have to first change my thinking. Because my thinking is wrong, my actions are going to be wrong. If my thinking is that self is first, if I listen to all the things the world are saying, if I'm conformed to the world's standard, I put me first. God says, or Paul would say, place God first. Don't conform to the world's standards. Conform to the will of God. God first, others second, self last. We think about just a simple conversation not a simple conversation, but this challenge that's given to Jesus and the response that he gives, we can find some application in how we ought to live our lives. And perhaps, as I mentioned earlier, appropriate during a time of year where political tensions are very high right now. And you might ask the question, how should you react to that? Paul responds again in Romans 13, submit yourself to the governing authority. They're placed there by God. But we need to remember also there's a power that's higher than that in which we ought to render service to. Placing our very lives in his hands to do the work that he has called us to do as his church, in his kingdom. To reach to the lost, to go into all the world and to make disciples, as was given in the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28, 19 and 20. As we close the sermon this morning, I'm going to use a phrase from last week's sermon. The sermon was about the parable of the wedding feast. And in that sermon, you remember that the father, who is represented by God in that parable, not sermon, but parable, you remember that the father said, "Go call the called." This morning, regardless of your relationship with God, he's calling you. If you haven't become a Christian yet, if you're not a child of his, he's calling you to be obedient to the gospel. And one of the greatest verses I think that represents this or explains this is Colossians chapter 1 and verse number 13, where there Paul, in writing to the Christians in Colossae, say that God took you out of darkness. When you become a Christian, he took you out of darkness and he placed you in the kingdom of his dear Son. That's what happens when you're obedient to the gospel, culminating in baptism for the forgiveness of sins. And so this morning, if you haven't been taken out of darkness and placed in the kingdom of his Son, he's calling you. How will you respond? But many in this auditorium this morning have answered that call. You recall in the parable of the wedding feast that there the called represent God's chosen people, the Jews. But he called them again a second time. See, he had initial calling for that there was going to be a wedding feast, and then when the wedding feast is ready, he had a second calling, and you know what they didn't do? They didn't answer the second call. And so this morning, if you've answered the first call, let me explain to you, God is calling you this morning as well. He's calling you to a life of spiritual service. He's calling you to help accomplish the work of the church, specifically if you're a member of this congregation, the work that we do here at the Bright Angel Church of Christ. Will you answer that call? Or will you ignore it? The invitation's yours. Will you respond as together we stand and sing?